shown that he can be a great regular season player. He's shown he can be the exact kind of hitter they could use in their lineup. They could use a left-handed bat. He's shown he can play in New York. He's shown he can play under pressure situations. I don't know what else you would want to see from Juan Soto to make him worthwhile of a pursuit if you're the Mets right now.
He is senior writer at The Athletic covering the New York Mets, and I bet his season coverage lasted a little bit longer than anticipated. Tim Britton joining us right now on FT. Tim, great to have you on, and have you taken a second to take a breath and look back at everything that just happened with the New York Mets, from the amazing run they had and the, I would say, entertaining components of their season that kept popping up?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. I did have to cancel a vacation that we had planned for the second week of October, which we had planned, sometime in May, thinking that, we don't have to worry too much about that time of the year when the team's 11 under 500. I was actually just talking with, my coworker, Will Salmon. We're planning a story for later in the week about like all of the crazy things that happened in 2024. And there's some that he's bringing up. And I'm like, man, that was this year? I don't remember Julio Teheran starting and winning a game for the Mets in Atlanta back in April. There's so many ridiculous things that happened for the Mets this year, and so many of them packed into really the last several weeks. Starting with that doubleheader in Atlanta, that this has become, I think, as memorable a season as the Mets have had. Maybe even more memorable than the World Series run that they made in 2015 for this fan base. It's been a wild ride.
Listen, it was a wild ride. It was incredible. I wanted a Subway Series more than anybody else. I thought that would have been awesome, but we'll set it for East meets West. I think that's great too as well. Talk about the Mets here, looking at the free agents. Wow. 2, 4, 6, 10 free agents. Some big names. Well, I mean, one I always look out for, Pete Alonso, man. What do you see his future? And talk a little about, what the Mets are looking for. I know it's early, but Pete's a big name.
Yeah, I mean, that's been the number one question around this team, really dating back to last offseason, is what is the future for Pete Alonso? We saw there seemed to be this chance that his Mets tenure was going to peter out in like the worst way possible. When he's coming to the plate in Milwaukee, that game 3 of the wild card series, he's 5 for his last 40 with no extra base hits. And you're thinking he could ground into a double play and that could be it for him. And instead he hits an opposite field 3-run homer, extends the season, gets on a little run himself in the National League Division Series against Philadelphia, hits another big 3-run homer against the Dodgers in the NLCS. So has a really good postseason. It kind of reminds people after, kind of a down season, a season that's not up to his standards. It's hard to say any season with 34 home runs is a down season. Remind people what he means to this lineup when he's clicking in the middle of it. The lineup has changed over the last couple of years where they're not as reliant on him as its only power source. Back in 2022, he hit almost like a quarter of their home runs. This year it was about 16% of their home runs. So they've got more power around him. But the Mets have been steadfast since last offseason. Basically, they're running the Brandon Nimmo playbook with him. And Alonso's running the same thing. Like, he hired Scott Boras before his last year, the same way Brandon Nimmo did. The Mets have not really negotiated any extension with him. They basically said, you go out and see what you can get. And then we'll be interested in matching it at a certain number. Scott Boras has said, Pete Alonso should get Prince Fielder money or Mark Teixeira money. That the Freddie Freeman contract would not be enough. We'll see how that works on the open market. If there is a team that's willing to go to that extent for Alonso, I don't think the Mets are that team. But if the market comes back to where they view it, which is probably more in that kind of Paul Goldschmidt contract range from his extension with St. Louis, then maybe they can get something done.
Is the play of Pete Alonso going to keep him in the postseason, going to keep him in New York? Or is the play of Mark Vientos in the postseason going to push Pete Alonso out of New York?
Yeah, I mean, that's the other really interesting component of this is Vientos had such a breakthrough season, a regular season, and then on top of it was their best and most consistent hitter in the postseason, and is probably not a long-term third baseman. He played third base better than I think anyone expected this season. I had heard from scouts for years, this guy cannot play third base at the major league level, and he did this year and was probably just slightly below league average defender there, made a lot of really nice plays over the course of the season. But if you sign Pete Alonso to a 5 or 6 year deal, what does that mean for Mark Vientos' long-term future defensively? Is it at third base for all of that stretch of time? Is it moving one of those guys to DH down the line? I think that's the other component of this because the Mets have a lot of moving pieces on their infield. A lot of their prospects coming up are second baseman, third baseman. Like, they still have Brett Beatty. They've got Ronnie Mauricio coming off a torn ACL. They've got Luis Angel Acuna, who debuted late in the season. So they've got a lot of different pieces there, but when you're in a win now position, you don't necessarily want to hand over an everyday job to someone in that position.
Listen, we're talking about position players. In my opinion, I feel like they need some pitching. I get it. You need both sides of the spectrum of baseball, but I feel like they need to get their bullpen a little better. I feel like Kodai Senga's, he's going to be their top guy, but after that, talk to me. Like who's going to be, 3, 4, and 5?
Yeah, I mean, you look at what their rotation is right now coming back. It would be Senga, David Peterson, who had a really nice year for them. Paul Blackburn, we just found out today, is going to be out through parts of spring training. The guy that they picked up at the trade deadline and got hurt pretty promptly. And then Tyler McGill, who's kind of, a depth option for them. But they've got to replace Sean Manaea, who's, I think, almost certainly going to opt out of what he's got left on his deal. They've got to replace Luis Severino, and they've got to replace Jose Quintana. 3 guys that they got so much more out of than they expected coming into the year, not just in terms of performance, but in terms of innings. Those guys all threw close to 100 innings more than they had thrown in 2023, which is a pretty insane stat. And you can see that they kind of just ran out of gas in the NLCS against that insane Dodgers lineup. So I think, Manaea is a guy that they'd be interested in bringing back at, a certain price point. He is 33. I don't think they want to sign him to a 5-year deal, but if there's a 3-year deal that makes sense, I think that could work for both sides. Severino, I think they'll extend the qualifying offer and see whether that works for him or what's available on the market. And then, they've got room financially. They've got a lot of money coming off the payroll. If they want to make a bigger investment, whether that's Corbin Burns, who David Stearns has familiarity with from his time in Milwaukee, whether that's Max Fried or Blake Snell or Jack Flaherty, other guys who are on the free agent market, whether it's trading for Garrett Crochet, I think adding to the top of their rotation, they've got some nice mid-rotation to back-end rotation guys. Adding to the top of it is probably the priority coming into this year, and something they knew last year, if they didn't get Yoshinobu Yamamoto, the one guy they tried to get big time in free agency, that they were going to have to address this offseason.
You said about Severino getting a qualifying offer. Pete Alonso is going to get a qualifying offer. Sean Manaea should get a qualifying offer when he opts out of his player option. Are they afraid of giving that many qualifying offers out? Or in a market like the Mets, is that not even an issue?
Yeah, I don't think it's really an issue for them. They clearly Alonso and Manaea I don't think would accept the qualifying offer. Severino could, decide that's, I don't know that who's going to get a 3 or 4 year deal worth the same average annual value as the QO. But I still think it's probably likelier than not that he turns it down. And hey, if you're the Mets, the worst case scenario is you've got a pretty good mid-rotation starter back and maybe a little bit more than you want to spend for him. And this is a team that they've got the luxury to do that if they want to. There's really no really bad 1-year deal that they could sign. And we saw how many the 1-year deals that David Stearns signed last offseason click for them and be a really important part of this team going where it did in the postseason.
Tim, I know you mentioned a lot coming off the books. It looks like close to $200 million off the books. I think in the 190 range. That gets them down to about, I think, 160-ish committed for next year at the moment. Obviously, a lot of holes to fill, though, with all the free agents we're talking about. But did you get any sense that they won't go back to the range where they're at? Right? David Stearns is cut from a different cloth with Milwaukee, where he was operating with a very tiny budget. He just took over this team. He made some really great moves, like you mentioned. But do you think, I'll just put this up there. What's the over-under if I put it at $300 million? Do you think that the Mets payroll next year for a single season will be over or under that number? Because I'm wondering if they felt like that's not necessarily the answer since, the Scherzer and Verlanders of the world didn't work out for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably take under, just spitballing it right now. The luxury tax is $241. I think they'd go over that pretty easily. They've got, like you said, they've got a lot of holes to fill, even with what they've got guaranteed on the books right now. But so much of what they spent this past year was on players who were not on the team. They were spending a lot on Verlander, on Scherzer, on James McCann. It was about $55 to $60 million on players who were no longer on the roster. They don't have any of those commitments next year. So they've got room to go pretty far. And we saw a willingness last year. Like, they offered Yamamoto $325 million. They were willing to go that far for a player they really liked. I think that's instructive when you think about how they might approach Juan Soto, a guy who's in his prime. Yamamoto's going to be 25, Soto's going to be 26, and that's the guy they really targeted last year. I think that's the guy that they'll really target this year and see what they can do in probably a bidding war with the other team in town. So I think Steve Cohen has said that he knows that the way to long-term sustainability is not signing 39-year-old future Hall of Fame pitchers every year. But I don't think that means he's not going to spend as freely as he has in the past.
And again, I know it's early, but the season just ended, so immediately Mets fans are riding high, and they're like, cool, we weren't even supposed to be that good this year. The playoffs was a bonus at all, and the fact that we got 2 wins away from the World Series is sick. So let's see what this offseason looks like. So just to double down on what you said with Soto, what do you think are the chances that they pursue him, not just because of who he is, but because of what the market looks like? You don't get a player like this available almost ever that is this good and this young. And when you look to future seasons, there aren't tons of 26-year-old superstars that are hitting the market. And I do think someone like David Stearns is super into a player like this because he feels like he's still going to get value for many years to come based on what age projections have, in models that most front offices use these days, right? It's much riskier to sign a player who's 30, 31 years old and see what, you get with a player in their mid to upper 30s. So do you think that because of that, it causes them to lead even more into the Juan Soto bucket?
Absolutely. I mean, you look at last offseason, there's a reason the Mets were so aggressive on Yamamoto, a pitcher who had never been in the major leagues, versus like Aaron Nola, who they were not interested in at all. A guy who had been in their division and pitched really, really well for a long stretch of time. So it was all about getting the prime years locked in. Yamamoto was going to be 25. You don't get 25-year-old pitchers on the free agent market ever. And Soto, is going to be 26. It's the same deal, just amplified to the nth degree because of what he's done in the major leagues over the course of his career. What he's doing right now for the Yankees, he's shown, he's checked every box you could have if you're the Mets. He's shown that he can be a great regular season player. He's shown he can be the exact kind of hitter they could use in their lineup. They could use a left-handed bat. They've got some room in the corner outfield if they need it. He's shown he can play in New York. He's shown he can play under pressure situations. I don't know what else you would want to see from Juan Soto to make him worthwhile of a pursuit if you're the Mets right now. So I think, this goes back to like 2001 when Alex Rodriguez was out there for the Mets. That's the kind of hype I think the fan base has around this to see if they can go after that kind of player, that kind of franchise cornerstone to add to what's already a pretty nice mix.
Does a season like this make Mets fans not fear Metting? Or is that just always going to be in the back of their mind, like, oh, until we win a World Series championship again, like, it's always going to be a fearful thing? Or how they built this team and kind of like not even trying to build this team type of thing? Like, does that give Mets fans more hope, or was it the entire postseason of, well, when's the next problem going to happen? When are we going to Met?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always going to be a segment of the fan base that is concerned about the Mets going full Met or whatever you want to call it. But I think a majority of the fan base really bought into this team, especially in the month of September and late in the season. And I've been pleasantly surprised by just how happy fans have been, even after the Game 6 loss the other night. There was not too much complaining about this managerial move or this player not coming through in the clutch. There was just a kind of enjoyment of what they had gone through over the past several months, really dating back to the end of May. So I think you got to stack those years on each other before you fully, forget all of that. Like I covered the Red Sox before this, it didn't all disappear with 2004. You got to have another good year in 2005, win another World Series in 2007 before you kind of reframe people's brains and how they view the team. But I think the Mets, under David Stearns, under Carlos Mendoza, this was as good a first year as you could have hoped for if you're a Mets fan. And it really encourages you for what they can be in the future.
We get it. Mornings are nuts. No time for breakfast, but you need to get your day started right.
What if a delicious, nutritious meal could be ready in seconds? Support for Foul Territory is brought to you by Huel, the world's #1 complete nutrition brand. With over 400 million meals sold worldwide, Huel is trusted by millions of people looking to fuel their days with convenient, complete nutrition. Try it for yourself with this exclusive FT offer. 15% off with the code FOUL at Huel.com.
We're all about saving time, but we get hangry, like a lot. I recently fell in love with the Huel Ultimate Super Greens Powder, which is a perfect blend of 91 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients. I also love their complete nutrition bars, and those hot and savory pouches are fire too.
FT fam, give it a shot. Get 15% off with the code FOUL at HUEL.com. Unlock a healthier, easier way to eat with Huel. nutritionally complete meals in minutes so you can focus on what really matters. I have a question about the pitching. So how did they do this? Because that's by far the most shocking component to me of what they were able to put together. I truly thought the offense was going to be good. I'm sure it was better than I anticipated in most others, but especially down the stretch. But the pitching is what stands out. You look at what they cobbled together, and you're like, okay, maybe one or two of these guys will hit, right? You're like, okay, maybe Severino will bounce back, or maybe Manaea. I mean, you certainly don't expect everybody to kind of all put it together. And then we're even going down the line like, David Peterson is this good suddenly? A guy who definitely had stuff and was a first-round pick, I think, years back, but you never saw him put it all together. So is there anything that you can point to from an organizational and coaching and development perspective? Because that also ties into what we look at going forward. So as good as the starting pitching was, Tim, obviously the bullpen faded down the stretch too. And it wasn't a World Series winning bullpen in my mind, maybe anyone's mind. So I'm curious, based off your first answer, does that lead this team to say, hey, we're going to David Stearns it like Milwaukee did and have these no names that emerge in the bullpen? Or are they going to spend money in that department too?
Yeah, I think to answer the first question, you go back to the last year and a half. They hired Eric Jagers to be their director of pitching development, a guy who's well regarded in the industry. Bring him in, they start their pitching lab, and I think there's just a better sense now for what they want to get out of their pitchers, developing a plan and getting the most out of them. So with a guy like Severino, it was bringing in a sinker that he hadn't thrown in several years to get him quicker contact, make him more effective against right-handed batters, and that became the pitch for him. Allowed him to go a lot deeper into games and pitch the number of innings that he did over the course of the season. With Peterson, it was a matter of getting him healthy after hip surgery in the offseason and just getting a better mindset of attacking the opponents. Manaea obviously made the arm slot change, which was more his idea than anyone with the Mets. But once he decided to do that, they were fully behind it and helped him extract the most out of himself that he could with a midseason change like that. So I think I wrote in September, it's nice that these guys have all done this, and you're a little worried, like, well, they're all going to be free agents basically, but now you can take what you've accomplished with them and you can pitch it to free agent pitchers and say, hey, look what we did with Luis Severino, look what we did with Sean Manaea. If you want your 1-year contract, why don't you come here to Queens and see what we can do with you? And that's a really good place to be in as an organization. And they can apply that to the bullpen as well. They've got some arms in there that they did really well with. A guy like Reed Garrett, who had been kind of on waiver claims back and forth for a while, emerged as an important arm for them and had a great April, kind of tailed off from that point, but was an important guy for them down the stretch. So they've been able to figure out how to get the most out of what they have. Now they just probably have to raise the floor of that bullpen in particular this offseason because they've got so many free agents there, kind of rebuild it a little bit, and then so that the guys you're bringing in and developing over the course of the season aren't your 8th inning guys. They're your 6th and 7th inning guys to help get the ball to Edwin Diaz and others in the back end.
You said they built a pitching lab at the minor league complex, right?
Yeah. That opened, I think, June of last year.
So how did that help the big league team?
Well, so last off season they were running guys through there. So they were running Severino, Sean Manaea, David Peterson, who was in rehab. I think it's a narrative that sometimes if we just put all this money into tech, that's 4 or 5 years from now that they're going to start getting prospects. To me, Jeremy Hefner should be mentioned as a guy that took big league vets and helped them get the most out of them, whether it was their decision or not. I just want to know how the correlation of the minor league pitching lab correlates to the big league success this year. Yeah, so at the end of last season, they sent every healthy pitcher in the organization went down to the pitching lab. So that included guys like Kodai Senga. That included guys like Tyler McGill and Reed Garrett and other guys we mentioned. A guy like Severino, he worked with Hefner individually over the course of the offseason. He went to Driveline. And I had gone to Driveline the year prior after the 22 postseason with San Diego and continued to work with those guys. So you're absolutely right. Hefner is a huge part of this. What he was able to do, kind of connecting with each different guy individually over the course of the season and figuring out how best to get the most out of them. It's not just that they pitched well and pitched as deep into the season as they did. There was a real camaraderie that developed that you don't often see with a bunch of guys on 1-year deals about to hit free agency again. We saw them, they're painting eye black with the starting pitcher's number on their face that night. Luis Severino, on the flight home from LA to New York, he flies to New York early ahead of the team, had 59 eye black on on the commercial flight that he flew to Queens. So you had that going on for them as well. So it was, it was probably a 99th percentile outcome for their starting rotation in particular this season. But it does bode well for what they can get out of guys moving forward, how they can pitch themselves to prospective pitchers in free agency. And then if they want to add a big name on top of that, well, then you feel really good about the rotation moving forward.
I want to go back real quick about the Mets versus Dodgers. Could they have done anything differently? I look back on one thing, and to me, starting Kodai Senga that first game, just because, listen, he gave up the home run against Philly, and then, he had two really good innings after that. I mean, maybe it was a little like, all right, well, we got him back, instead of being like, okay, maybe we need to hinder him back. Was there anything you think they could have done a little thing differently that could have helped them, get close to winning this series?
I think if there is one thing you want to point to, it's probably that. I see it from both sides because, Senga, the reason they started him in game one of the division series was it was either him or McGill, who's kind of their fifth starter. So it made sense to roll the dice with Senga and see what you had there. In the NLCS against LA, they had Severino rested, they had Manaea rested, so they could have gone with either of those guys in game one. And I think going into the series, I expected it to be Manaea. As the series progressed, you saw kind of why they probably waited with those guys. And it's because of the fatigue they'd experienced. That, Manaea had pitched on 4 days of rest the entire month of September. He had thrown a lot of pitches. And they just thought that, he was hitting a wall. And he mentioned it himself after game two, that he hit a wall in the sixth inning of that game when he was pitching well. That they thought he needed the extra day of rest more than anyone. So that's why they went with Senga in game one, was to give those guys who had carried them for so long the extra day. It did, it obviously backfired the worst way possible in that, Senga doesn't pitch well. You use Peterson for a lot of pitches. He doesn't pitch well. And then you can't bring him back in relief when you might have really needed him in game three or game four behind your starter. So that got them behind the eight ball from really the jump in the series. But when you lose, 4 games by, I think, at least all of them by at least 5 runs, it's tough to point to one managerial decision or one organizational decision and say, well, that would have fixed giving up 46 runs in 6 games.
Okay, then I'll go to another managerial decision. Should Jesse Winker have gotten more at-bats? Or which swung it more, bringing Phil Maton into too many games after it seemed like he was struggling?
Yeah, I think with Winker, I think in retrospect, you can definitely say he should have started game 3 at least, which is against Walker Buehler. I understand sitting the lefty against Yamamoto because of his really, really pronounced reverse splits. And I think Martinez got on base twice in that game. I'd have to look back. But, Winker was a difference maker in their lineup just because of, we talked all series about how the Dodgers didn't chase. And Winker is that guy on the Mets. He's the guy who does not leave the strike zone and makes the starting pitcher work. So I think, in retrospect, I think even Carlos Mendoza would probably tell you that maybe we should have gone with Winker in game 3. With Maton, I trace that more back to like the end of the regular season. You go to that final weekend in Milwaukee, and he pitched, they pitched him and Edwin Diaz in a 5-0 game on that final Sunday of the regular season, which set them back for the Monday doubleheader in Atlanta, which sets them back for the wild card series. So I think Maton, at one point he was used 4 out of 5 days that week. And from that point forward, he just didn't have it. And, he talked about it openly. Like, he's not a guy who throws 98. He's not going to blow the ball by you in the strike zone. He relies on the precise execution, location of his pitches. And when you're tired, that's the first thing to go, that even more so than his velocity. And so he was just a different guy in the division series in LCS because of how much he'd been used down the stretch.
Man, he was fun to watch too, Winker. He was fun. He was embracing the villain role. Obviously now, he's beloved in Milwaukee. I'm kidding, but in Queens. So yeah, I hope you had a good time covering him. Right? I mean, he's a fun guy to cover. You'll get a soundbite from him if you catch him on the right day, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite quotes of the postseason was someone asked Carlos Mendoza before, I think game 3 in Milwaukee. Do you think this series might mean a little more to Winker because of the way the crowd has treated him here? Mendoza just deadpan like, oh, is this different from anywhere else? Like they boo him everywhere we go.
Oh, yeah.
When I walk by him in the hallway, I boo him. That's how I greet him. I think Winker brings that different kind of edge to a roster and a lineup, and I think that that's a reason why there might be a match here longer term beyond this season because of the way he played down the stretch. He said all along, like, it was a dream come true to play for this team, and he would love to extend that relationship beyond the season.
Hey, there's some players that are fueled by that, and we have one on our show quite frequently who enjoyed that, who lived and thrived off that, and Pierzynski. So, Tim, awesome coverage, really great reading everything that you were bringing to the table in The Athletic. Thanks for swinging by right after the season. And lastly, did you reschedule the vacation? Do you get to go now, just like a little later on?
We might try it in the spring. It was up to Maine. Maine is not the greatest place to go in November and December, so we'll figure out a different time to do that.
Confirmed, winter is coming to the Northeast, and especially even further up. We're in Jersey, but in Maine, yeah, it's getting chilly. So, Tim, thanks, man. Enjoy the off season.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, appreciate it. At Tim Britton on Twitter to give him a follow. Senior writer at The Athletic, covering the Mets. Tons of great articles. And then for our podcast purposes, we've got our Metsed Up hosts running ship all off season long. They're going to have a lot to cover. As you just heard, the Mets are going to spend. So our guys will be all over it. Draftneck Mark and James with your coverage. Just search Metsed Up wherever you get your podcasts, or if you're on YouTube, go for it.
Hey, everybody. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content.
We're back here every weekday, all year long, so do not miss an episode.
The videos are coming in all day. Here's another video you might enjoy.
Baseball the way it should be covered.